In the previous lesson, I gave you a crash course on getting started with classes in PHP. We discussed the syntax, instantiation, encapsulation. So now let's try to make it a little bit more real world for programming, and let's consider the use cases for a database class. Well, as I noted in the previous lesson, in addition to the idea of OOP, you can also use a class for the simple purpose of grouping together related functions. So consider this database class. Well, when we instantiate it, we first want to connect to the database. And we're going to use pseudocode here so that we can keep our mind on the class and not the actual code that we're using. So when you create a new instance of it, we want to connect to the database. So let's imagine that we create this variable called con, and our pseudocode will be connected. So now we've created this variable, but now we have this other function where maybe we want to insert. So we will call it insert. And now we want to gain access to that variable. But if I run echo connection, we're not going to be able to have access to that connection. Well, let's try it out. New database. And we'll store that within a variable called db. And now I will run db insert. And let's see what happens here. And sure enough, we do get undefined variable connection. So this is a problem. We know we need to connect to the database when we instantiate, but also we know that other methods will need to have access to that connection so that they can perform other database operations. So why don't we instead store it as a property on the class? So protected connection, like that. And now when we initialize our new object, we can run this connection equals our connection. So now if I run it, I can echo this con, and if we did everything right, now notice that we are able to pass that variable around. Also notice that I set this to protected. So you might be thinking, well, why not set that to public? In this case, the connection, well, that's not something the user of our class would ever use. And that's something you need to get your mind around of. If you build a class that somebody else who maybe didn't build the class would use, what properties and methods would they need to have access to? They would not need to have access to the connection itself. They can create a new connection, but that variable itself, they don't need to have access to that. So we could set it to either protected or private. If this will only ever be a single class, nobody would extend the class to add functionality. Private is fine. But just to be safe, I'm going to set it to protected. And that way, this class or any other classes that extend it can have access to that variable. So now we have this pseudo insert method. We can do some operation and we can return inserted rows. Or you could return true or false depending upon whether the insertion was successful. And then you could have another function or method for maybe get, and that will be to get all rows from a specific table. But you have to think about it. When we call get, well, that's going to need to know what the table name is. So why don't we accept that as an argument, table? And now we can run db get from posts, like that. So then at this point, you would prepare the query, select star from the table name, and then you could also limit if you want. You could set an optional limit equals 10, and then the user has the option of overriding that if they want to. Set it to 3 or 30 or nothing at all, in which case the limit will be 10. So what I want you to note here is that these methods are related, and so they are grouped together under this single database class. And don't forget, you can and should still adopt namespacing. Maybe this is under the app namespace, or maybe you have a sub-namespace. I'm not sure. It would depend on your project. We'll put it under our app namespace for now, or the name of your company, whatever you want to call it. So now we create our new database. We're connecting to the database. Next, we have these methods that we can use. Here's our pseudo get method that accepts a table and a limit. And now if we echo posts, of course, in your application, that would represent all of the rows from that query, and we got the rows. And you would do the same thing. You would say public function. Maybe you would have a where function, and this could accept key and value. And then we're saying return where the key equals the value. That would be the actual code that you would write. So now we could say something like posts equals db where ID equals 5, and then we would echo posts return where key equals the value. Or if we want, let's say return where key equals value. And of course, we can't use interpolation in single quotes. It needs to be within double quotes. There we go. Now, if we reload it, we can have that information. So we would query the database, grab all the rows from the table where the ID equals 5. But then also maybe you want to have specific things where you set the table where all operations would be run from. So maybe at the top you could say public function set table, and then you would say this table equals table, whatever they specify, like that. And now we have protected table like so. Then when we run functions like get, we could say get the rows from this table, like that. So let's try it out. Now we've connected to the database, and we're going to say db set table, and this will be the users table. And now I will run db get, and we can remove this now, like so. So we'll get 5 rows from the users table. Rows and echo rows, and if I run it, now we got the rows from the users table. So what I want you to think about is how this is far more convenient and flexible. By containing everything within this one database class, it becomes that much easier to work with your code and extend the code. Of course, we are only working with pseudocode here, but this would be really easy to pop in some of the code that we had worked with in the other lessons if you're not taking advantage of something like PHP Active Record. So what are some other ideas for classes that you could create? Well, we talked about the database class. That's kind of the 101 that you'll learn. You could also create maybe a class for thumbnails. So you would have class thumbnail, and this would contain the necessary methods and properties to create thumbnails on the fly. So you feed it a thumbnail that's 1,000 pixels, and you want to turn that into a 50 by 50 pixel thumbnail. Well, you could create a class that would do that for you. And then you could do things like new thumbnail, like this. And the first parameter would be the name of the image, image.jpg, and what you want it to be. So we'll say 50 by 50. And then that class would generate a new thumbnail. Or you could simply instantiate it with the name of the file, and then you could say thumb generate 100 by 100, like that. And maybe you could even set the coordinates. So the center coordinates would be 40 from the left and 200 from the top of the image, or something like that. But notice how convenient that is, and it's more elegant and readable. Now, rather than having all of that code within our main project, we abstract it away to its own class. Then we can create a new instance of the class, we call the necessary method, and then, of course, that is much easier on the eyes and easier to work with in the future when we come back to our project 6 months down the line.